Hello and welcome to today's Read Aloud series. This video we are going to be continuing our story Hot Money. So we stopped at chapter 8 last week where investigations were still going on and Malcolm is safely ensconced in America. Ian is trying to find out how the psyche of his family members who he has been estranged from a very long time works, and so far he has gotten only a little bit of cooperation from Gervaise's wife Ursula, because Gervais does not listen to anybody's logic aside from his mother's voice in his head. So chapter 8 stopped at where the superintendent was like, oh, Ian has to come to the house to see something at Quantum that the explosives expert had discovered. And so that is where we're continuing from in chapter 9. At Quantum, the heap of rubble had been reduced to merely a mess. A pale sunshine washed the scene, making it to my eyes more of a wasteland than ever. Superintendent Yale stood beside a trestle table. Okay, of course, we are going to be having our vocabulary games as usual. With the explosives man, Smith, close beside him, heads bent in conference. I walked over to the experts and said good morning. Good morning, they said, looking up. Smith picked up an object from the table, holding it out to me. We found this with the remains of Mr. Pembroke's room. What do you think? I took the thing from him. It had been a coil of thin plastic-coated wire, about 18 inches long, but the coils had been stretched, making the wire straighter. About an inch of bare wire stuck out of the plastic at each end. Onto the plastic, near one end, someone had bonded a hand from a clock, so that the wire was an extension of the hand. I looked at it with despair. I had been fearing and hoping, trying not to believe it possible. When I didn't ask what it was, Gail said with awakening suspicion, "Does your silence mean that you know what it is?" "Yes," I said drearily. "Did you find any other bits?" Smith pointed to a spot on the table. There were some pieces of metal and plastic and a grey plastic disc with a small hole in the center. He turned the plastic disc over to reveal a clock face on the other side. Yale could contain himself no longer. "Will you please explain your familiarity with this device?" he said formidably. "Did the gardener use this sort of thing for blowing up your tree stump?" "No, I don't think so. This device wasn't meant for setting off bombs. It was a toy." "What sort of toy?" "Well, it was for switching things on, like the lights we had on the station in a train set. It was incredibly simple." "Explain," Yale commanded. "You get an old or cheap clock," I began. "You glue a long length of wire to one of the hands like this, so that a bare bit of wire sticks out beyond the edge of the clock face. Then you have the free end of that wire coming out from the center of the front of the clock, and you fasten it to a battery. You need two more lengths of wire. One goes from the battery to whatever you want to activate. Then the other wire goes back from that to the clock case itself and is fastened to it in such a way that the bare end of wire juts out forward." I sighed and demonstrated with the clock face. "You wind up the clock. The wired hand travels round towards the jutting out wire and eventually hits against it. The circuit is thus complete and your lights or whatever go on." Well, I finished lamely. "That's how we made them." "Them?" Yale said with apprehension. "I don't know how many we had, but quite a few. There might be one still in the playroom. The old train sets are there." Yale looked at me balefully. "How many of your family saw these devices?" "Everyone." "Your whole family knows how to make a simple time switch?" "Yes, I should think so." Not surprisingly, they decided to take a look in the playroom. I hadn't been in the room at all since the twins had gone. I dragged out the train box, but there were no clocks in it. Smith began looking into any box whose contents weren't easily identifiable. "Well, just look here," he said suddenly. "Gold mine." He produced from a jumble of Lego toy constructions a bright, new-looking clock with a Mickey Mouse face in unfaded color. To the minute hand was fixed a coil of plastic-covered wire. A second coil was stuck to the clock casing, its bare end jutting out. I looked at it blankly. I've never seen that one before. Smith picked away among the toys. He rattled around and finally, triumphantly, produced a red and white Lego tower with a bulb holder lodged inside near the top. A lighthouse, wouldn't you say? He asked. Neat. Are you sure you never saw the clock? Yale said. I shook my head. Someone must have made it for my twin brothers. I didn't live here then, only visited. Yale nodded. I'll find out who made it. He located an empty box and into it packed the bright coaster of an act that had brought half the house down. Then he packed the lighthouse too and marched off with the box. I left Smith and started out on a hike around the garden to make sure all was well with the gold, and came upon Arthur Belbrook digging potatoes within 6 feet of it. My heart jumped a bit. We exchanged good mornings and remarks about the weather. I left him bending again to his task, not sure whether he was a guardian of the gold or a threat to it. Malcolm had nerve, I thought, hiding his stockpile so close to where Arthur worked day after day. Malcolm had more nerve than was good for him. I drove to the inn in Cookham and, accompanied by Norman Westnote, went in to lunch. I read, Mr. Thomas Pembroke, 39, lives with his wife Berenice at 6 Arding Hacienda, Soning. Two daughters, 9 and 7. Mr. T used to work as a quantity surveyor for a firm of biscuit makers. He got sacked for wrong estimates several weeks ago. Mr. T didn't tell his wife. He went off as if to work every day. On Newmarket Sales Tuesday, he was walking about, same as previous Friday. Pressed, he says he went to the public library. Mr. T drives old grey Austin 1100. Has dent in front fender. Mr. T's opinion of Mr. Ian is model. Mr. Ian is, in quote, best of bunch, end quote. But also Mr. Ian is, in quote, Mr. Pembroke's favorite and it isn't fair, end quote. Mr. T on brink of nervous breakdown, parenthesis of Norman West, my opinion. Mrs. Bernice Pembroke, 44, spends her days doing housework. She couldn't produce alibi for either day. Mrs. B drives old white Morris Maxi, clean with no marks on it. Mrs. B gave no opinion of Ian when asked, but looked as if she could spit. Says Mr. Pembroke is wicked. Haciendas were dreadful. Tiny houses of dark brown red brick and front gardens one could cross in one stride. I rang the bell of number 6. Berenice opened the door. We don't want to see you, she said when she saw me. Dear Thomas isn't well. You have no right to come here. I hate you. Well, hate or not, I want to talk to Thomas. She couldn't say he wasn't there because I could see him standing in the sitting room. Come in, old chap, he said over Berenice's objections. Thomas was looking haggard, desperation all pervading. I was shocked. I hadn't seen him, I realized, for quite a long time. He was a lot further down the line to disintegration than Gervais. Ferdinand, he confirmed in answer to my question, had told him about Malcolm's wish that I should try to find out who wanted to kill him. Thomas said he couldn't help. I reminded him of the day old Fred blew up the tree stump. Thomas remembered it clearly. He had carried Serena on his shoulders and Fred had been blown flat. And do you remember the time switches we used to make? He stared, his eyes gaunt. Let's just mark what gaunt means. After a long pause, he said, yes. Thomas, after Gervais and Ferdinand left Quantum, did you or they make any more of them? Berenice interrupted. Dear Thomas couldn't make a time switch to save his life. Could you, darling? Her voice was pitying, sneering. Thomas sent her a haunted look, but no protest. Someone gave Robin and Peter one of those Mickey Mouse clocks. It had plastic covered wires on it, I said. Thomas just shook his head helplessly. They found a clock hand stuck onto a long plastic covered wire in the rubble. Someone who knew how to make those time switches blew up Quantum. What of it? Bernice said. I can't see Thomas doing it. Not enough nerve, have you, darling? Thomas said to me. Have a drink? Berenice looked disconcerted. Asking me to have a drink had been for Thomas an act of rebellion. I accepted. He handed me a glass. His hand was trembling. He made an awkward motion and accidentally knocked the gin bottle over so that it fell to the floor, smashing into green shiny pieces, the liquid spreading in a pool. Thomas picked up the bits. Berenice didn't help. She said, Thomas can't get anything right, can you, darling? The acid sarcasm in her voice had gone from scathing to unbearable. Thomas straightened with a face filled with passionate hatred, the worm turning at last, and by the neck held the top part of the green bottle, the broken edges jagged as teeth. He came up fast with his hand rising. Berenice, cushioned in complacency, wasn't even looking at him. I dropped my own drink, grasped Berenice by both her arms, and swung her violently out of the slicing track of the razor-sharp weapon. She was furiously indignant, unaware of what had been happening. Thomas looked at me for a long blank second, then dropped the fearsome bottle and turned to stumble up towards his front door. I took 2 strides and caught him by the arm. Let me go, he struggled, and I held on. Let me go. I can't do anything right. She's right. She's bloody wrong. I was stronger than he, and I practically flung him into one of the armchairs. You listen to me, I said. You both listen to me. You're over the edge. You're going to have to face some straight facts. Berenice had finally realized how close she had come to needing stitches. She turned to Thomas with a bitterly accusing face and opened her mouth. Shut up, I said roughly. If you're going to tell him he's incompetent, don't do it. Sit down and shut up. She sat down weakly, her body slack, eyes shocked. You goaded him too far, always picking him to pieces. You have now completely succeeded. He can't function anymore. Dear Thomas, she began. If he were your dear Thomas, I said, you would help him and encourage him, not sneer. You just think what you stirred up in him today, and if I were you, I'd be careful. I turned to Thomas, and it's not all her fault. You've let her cap all this time. You should have stopped her years ago. You've been loyal to her beyond reason, and she's driven you to want to kill her. I didn't mean it. Thomas put his head in his hand. Come on, I said to him. I'm taking you out of here. On your feet, brother. There's still life ahead. Just then, the front door opened with a bang to let in the 2 girls home from school. Hello, they said noisily, bringing in swirls of outside air. What's going on? What's all this glass? A bottle got broken, I said. The younger one looked at the bowed head of her father, and in a voice that was a devastating mimic of her mother's, vibrating with venom, said, I'll bet it was dear Thomas who broke it. Berenice heard for herself what she had been doing to her husband, heard what she was implanting in her own children. The revelation seemed to overwhelm her, and she sought for excuses. If we had more money, if only Malcolm, it's not fair. But they had 2 cars thanks to their trust fund, and Thomas's unemployment had brought no immediate financial disaster. Money wasn't their trouble, nor would it cure it. Why didn't you get a job? I said to Berenice. What did you ever expect of Thomas? He did the best he could. I wanted a son, she said flatly. Thomas said 2 children were enough. We couldn't afford any more. It wasn't fair. Malcolm should have given us more money. I always wanted a son. Dear Lord, I thought. Flat, simple words at the absolute heart of things. Disappointment that had poisoned their lives. So much unhappiness from wanting the unobtainable. So much self-damage. I went across to Thomas and touched him on the shoulder. He stood up. He didn't look at his family. I put my hand lightly under his elbow and steered him to the front door. I took Thomas to Lucy's house. It seemed to me that Lucy's particular brand of peace might be just what Thomas needed. Lucy was in to my relief and opened the front door of the farm cottage where she and Edwin led the simple life near Marlow. She stared at us, at Thomas's hanging head. Sister dear, I said cheerfully, 2 brothers needing succor come knocking at thy gate. Any chance of hot sweet tea? Edwin appeared behind her looking peevish. What is this? You'd better come in, Lucy said. She took Thomas by the hand and led him into her book-filled sitting room, where she put him in an armchair and in a very short time thrust a mug of hot tea into his unwilling hand. Do you want some yourself? She said. Just with milk. I followed her into the kitchen. The last straw, I said, has just broken Thomas and he's in need of a bed. If someone doesn't treat him kindly, he'll end up in a nut house or the suicide statistics. And I am not, repeat, not joking. She looked at me doubtfully, then her face softened slightly. He could stay, she said, but not for his natural span. She went back to the sitting room and I again followed. Edwin had taken the second armchair. Lucy lowered her bulk onto a leather stool beside Thomas, which left me on my feet, looking around. Resignedly, I sat on the floor and leaned against the wall. As I'm here, I said, I may as well ask the questions I was going to come and ask tomorrow. We don't want to answer, Edwin said. Why not practice on me? I said. The police will ask about the timing device that set off the bomb at Quantum. Thomas stared. I made it, the Mickey Mouse Club clock. It was the first time he had spoken since we left his house. Do you remember those clocks? I asked Lucy. Of course I do. We've got one upstairs. Thomas made it for our son. Did the Mickey Mouse clock explode? No, I said. The one actually used had a grey plastic dial. The Mickey Mouse clock was intact in the playroom. Thomas said dully, I haven't made one for years. When did you make the Mickey Mouse for Robin and Peter? I asked. I didn't make it for them. I made it a long time ago for Serena. It made her laugh. She must have given it to them. It says Malcolm right the house was blown up, Edwin said with barely suppressed violence. He's never been fair to Lucy. You've always been in the way, buttering him up, taking the lion's share, while we have to struggle along on a pittance. Okay, let's just be accurate about what pittance means. Is that the authentic voice of Vivian? I asked. It's the truth. No, I said. It's what you have been told over and over again, but it's not the truth. Most people believe a lie if they are told it often enough. Thomas has been told ad infinitum that he's useless and now he believes it. I'm going now, Lucy. I stood up without haste. You tell Thomas over and over that he's a worthwhile person and maybe he'll begin to believe that instead. You have to believe in yourself to get anywhere. Oh yes, she said quietly. You do. What you've written, I said, is forever. Her eyes widened. How do you know that I've lost? I guessed. I bent and kissed her cheek to her surprise. Are you seriously in need? Financially? She was startled. No worse than usual. Of course we are, Edith said to her waspishly. What does waspishly mean now, for God's sake? You are earning almost nothing now and you still spend a fortune on books. Lucy looked only mildly embarrassed. Why don't you work, Edwin? I asked. Lucy doesn't like bustle. He seemed to think his explanation enough. We'll be perfectly happy if Malcolm trebled Lucy's trust fund as he ought to. He has millions. It's not fair. Doesn't Lucy despise money? I asked. Blandly, my half-sister said, there's no such state as perfection. On Thursday, I took a lazy day off from the emotional battering of the family and went to London to get my American and Australian visas. It was only a week since I had ridden Park Railings at Cheltenham, and it felt like eternity. I thought about how sanity lay in racing stables. I felt unfit, not riding. The next morning, I dropped in on a public library to look up explosives in encyclopedias. The knowledge was all there, available to anyone who sought it. Afterward, I studied more of Norman West's notes. Of Lucy, among other things he had written, goes for rambling walks, can't remember where she was on days in question, and Edwin spent hours in library reading, doing crossword puzzles. Idle life suits him. So much for the two of them. The notes on Donald and Helen weren't any more helpful. Westward's champagne lifestyle seemed to sum up their situation rather nicely. After lunch, I went over to their house. Helen was more resigned than annoyed to see me. Ferdinand said you would come, and we had the police here yesterday. Not that we could tell them anything, or you either. She took me into the sitting room and pointed to a chair. Donald came bustling in, telling me he could give me 10 minutes. Don't see what you can do, he said. Leave it to the police. What did they ask you? About Fred. What did they ask you? About Fred blowing up the tree stump. I said, yes, of course we've been there. Helen and I weren't then married. It was the first time she had met Malcolm. She was staying the weekend. And the time switch clocks, do you remember those? Naturally, Donald said. Helen added, Thomas made two for our boys for their birthday once. They got lost in one of our moves. Where's Malcolm? Donald asked brusquely. I feel like I've checked the meaning of brusquely before, but let's be sure. I don't know. You're lying, he said, but for once I wasn't. Malcolm and Ramsey Osborne had left the Osborne residence, according to the female voice on the line when I called the evening before, and had given her no number at which they could be reached. Did either of you, I asked, trace Malcolm to Cambridge the weekend he was put in the car? The question had come at them unexpectedly, and Helen practically jumped. The hotel at Cambridge said three people had asked if Malcolm was staying there. One was Norman West. Did one of you trace Malcolm? This is a picture of Helen and Donald. If you can see them. They're actually very pretty, like handsome couple is what I would say. Did one of you trace Malcolm? They looked at me glumly. Then Helen said, I suppose so. Why? I asked. Donald cleared his throat. I needed his signature on a guarantee for a temporary bank loan. I thought we had to have the money in a hurry, Helen put in. The bank manager had told Donald we could borrow it if Malcolm would guarantee it. Then we couldn't get hold of Malcolm. We had to think where he might be, and he's always going to Cambridge. And then, well, Donald went over to the golf club, and I just picked up the telephone book and phoned those hotels in Cambridge, and Malcolm was there at the second. When Donald came home, I told him, and the extraordinary thing was he had the same idea and got the same result. She paused. We were pretty desperate, you see. What did you need the money for? I asked. They looked at each other, foreheads wrinkled in worry. Reluctantly, Donald said we had some interest to pay at once or they would start proceedings. The desperation still echoed in his voice. The finance company was inflexible. I knew Malcolm wouldn't give me the money, but I did think he might guarantee. To save the whole pack of cards from collapsing, perhaps he might. But you didn't get in touch with him, did you? I asked. No, Donald said. Helen thought of a different way out. Pawned my bubbles. So I feel like bubbles are like a generalized term for maybe jewelry or something gold or shiny. But let's be sure. Pawned my bubbles, she said with a brave attempt at lightness. She held her head high, refusing to cry. What day did you pawn them? Wednesday. Wednesday, I thought, the day after someone had failed to kill Malcolm at Newmarket. When did the finance company start threatening you? The Thursday before, Helen said. They gave us a week. Vivian tried to get Malcolm to give us some money, Donald said with resentment, and he flatly refused. Helen said, you're the only one he'll listen to. I don't care if you get millions more than us. If you could just, I'll try, I promised. But they'll believe what they'll believe, the whole lot of them, feeding and reinforcing their fears every time they consulted. I left Donald and Helen behind their shaky facade and drove to Quantum to see how things were developing. Not fast was the answer. The place was abandoned except for a solitary uniformed policeman sitting in a police car outside what had been the front door. He picked up his car radio and spoke into it to the effect that Mr. Ian Pembroke had come by. A request would come back. Would Mr. Pembroke please drop in at the police station later? I walked around to the back of the house. The last of the rubble had been cleared away, and a black plastic sheet lay where the walls had tumbled down. The interior doors had been sealed with plywood, like the windows. The interior doors had been sealed with plywood like the windows, and the staircase had been barred off. A house with its center turnout. It looked terrible. Arthur Belbrook was cleaning his spades, getting ready to leave. I gave him a check for his wages for that week and the next two, and added a chunk for the care of the dogs. He gave me dignified thanks and said he hoped Mr. Pembroke was all right. Poor man. Then he set off homeward. I stared at the house and then walked back and took my leave. The house from a distance looked just as bad, if not worse. At the police station, Superintendent Yale shook my hand. They were no nearer to discovering who had planted the bomb. He said inquiries were proceeding and perhaps I could help. We interviewed the former gardener, Fred Perkins, Yale told me. We asked him about the tree stump and what sort of a fuse he used to blow it up. He said he had got the black powder and some detonators and some fuse cord from a quarryman friend of his. The detonators were in a separate tin with the cord. I was interested. What else did he say? Hill sighed. We asked him what he had done with the other detonators. He says Mr. Pembroke took them away from him that morning when he came running out of the house. We need to ask your father what he did with them. So, where is he? I really don't know, I said slowly. I can probably find him, but it will take a day or two. I thought for a moment, then said, surely he would have thrown away those detonators years ago. If he had any sense, he wouldn't have thrown them anywhere. Yale said, Mr. Smith says you should handle detonators with extreme caution. Mr. Pembroke's correct course would have been to turn them over to the police. Maybe he did, I said. Would like to find out. But would detonators still detonate after 20 years? It's possible, perhaps likely. What does a detonator look like? I asked. He hesitated. Mr. Smith said we might be looking for a small aluminium tube, pencil thin and about 6 centimeters long. Did Mr. Smith find out what the quantum bomb was made of? Yes, handful as he thought. He said the whole thing was amateur in the extreme. Amateurs, I said dryly, run faster than anyone else. As an amateur, I went to Kempton Park the next day and on young Higgins beat the heck out of a lot of professionals. I didn't know what possessed me. It seemed that I rode on a different plane. For some reason, George and Joe had entered young Higgins in a high-class open 3-mile steeplechase, and I was the only amateur in sight. Yet, the professional jockeys I rode against thought of amateur opponents as frivolous, unfit nuisances who caused accidents and endangered lives. Perhaps because of an arrogant desire to prove them wrong. Perhaps because of the insights and realities had faced in a traumatic week. Perhaps because of young Higgins himself. I rode with a sharp new perception of what was needed for winning, and the horse and I came home in front by 4 lengths to a fairly stunned silence from the people in the stands. George and Joe were ecstatic. Young Higgins tossed his head at the modest plaudits. So let's a newspaper man called the result a fluke. I had cracked it, I thought. I'd graduated. That had been real professional riding. Even if I was already 33 and had discovered very late the difference between enjoyment and fire. The end of chapter 9. So time for vocabulary games with our trusty dictionary. Let's start from back forward. And the last word we found was plaudit. Plaudit. A round of applause. 2. Often in plural. Enthusiastic expression of approval or praise. And if you look at the conversation, the context, it goes, young Higgins, that's Ian's horse, tossed his head at the modest plaudit. So we understand that now. And the next word to check is bubbles. Pawned my bubbles. Helen pawned her bubbles to save her family from, to save their house, I think, from the banks taking it away from them. She pawned it, she didn't sell it, she pawned. Everyone knows pawning means, like, you get selling your stuff at a second hand place. But what are bubbles? Bubble. Plaything, a small showy cheap ornament. The sentence actually reads, pawned my bubbles, she said with a brave attempt at lightness. She held her head high, refusing to cry. So they are not actually cheap ornaments, like they were not bubbles, they were probably very expensive, valued jewelries that They probably both, you know that Donald and Helen, they're very showy people. They live above their means. So they probably, like Helen probably bought, I mean Donald probably bought her diamonds or stuff like that, emeralds, all those like treasured stones, whatever. So but she sold them off. That's how she was able to save herself, save her family from the court. So they cannot be cheap playthings, cheap ornaments if they were valuable enough to pay off a bit of their debt. So yeah, she was just trying to be, trying to be flippant about it, like, okay, I don't care what happened, like it's not that important to me. But she also goes ahead to say she held her head high, refusing to cry. So it probably really, really stung. Let's check the next word. Glumly. Glumly, being in low spirits, dejected, dismal, gloomy. So very simple meaning. Being in low spirit. I could have guessed this, like I actually guessed it, but I wanted to be specific. They looked at me glumly, then Helen said, I suppose so. And Donald and Helen still talking to Ian or something about their situation. Pittance is the next word. Pittance, um, a meager monetary allowance, a very small salary or remuneration, a small portion or amount. So that makes sense because Edwin and yeah, Edwin and Lucy, Edwin was just like blowing up, talking nonsense, saying you've always been in the way, buttering him up, taking the lion's share, while we have to struggle along on a pittance. So as in Edwin feels like what Lucy enjoys from Malcolm as his child, as his daughter, is a pittance. Like a whole ass trust fund is a pittance. Okay. I've heard you, Edwin, you crazy clown. Yeah. The next word, waspishly. Waspishly or waspish. Relating to or like a wasp. Two, easily irritated. This word is very interesting to me. Like, this is not the first time I've come across this word, but whenever I read it, I always just imagine that it meant, like, I'll just interpret it contextually. Like, okay, it means the manner of which they are speaking. You get, which, yes, it means the manner of which they're speaking, which is like easily irritated and all of that. But I never imagined that it would be like a wasp. And wasps are like, at the slight disturbance, they burst out and they sting everything in sight, so they are easily irritated. Like, it just makes sense. I never connected it to wasp. I connected it to, I don't know, in my head I used to see this B movie and the way the characters used to move their mouth. So I'll be like, waspishly, probably how the cartoon was moving their mouth also. That's why it's good to use your dictionary and find new words. Oh my god. Okay, let's go to the next word. Brusquely. Brusquely. Brusque. Rudely. Abrupt. Rudely abrupt. Blunt. This is also a manner of speaking. And of course, Donald will speak to Ian in such an abrupt, rude manner. Everybody thinks Ian is the enemy, so they're going to talk to him how they see fit, how you speak to your enemy. So the next word is gaunt. Talking about how Thomas stared, eyes gaunt. Gaunt, thin and bony, angular. Two, emaciated and haggard, bleak and desolate, barren, a gaunt landscape. So like pretty bad, like pretty like quite descriptive of how terrible Thomas seemed, how he looked in general. What's the next word? Trestle. A trestle table. I've heard this word before, but I just used to imagine like a table, picture of the table just come in my head and I'm like, okay, that's it. But what does trestle mean? Now, that's what I love about this dictionary. Trestle itself is here, and then there's a trestle table like entry. So let's see. Should we check trestle table or trestle? Let's talk about trestle first. A horizontal beam or bar held up by two pairs of divergent legs and used as a support as for a table. That's what trestle mean. Or a framework composed of vertical slanted support and horizontal cross pieces holding up a bridge. So now, trestle table. A table that is supported by trestles, especially one having two or three supporting trestles connected by a longitudinal bar rather than legs. This one we have to check for pictorial example, because the definitely description is very thorough, but like I somehow can't make sense of it. So I feel like I need to check like a picture a picture to see what it is. So is that all? Yeah, that is all for today. I'm going to include the picture, don't worry. Yeah, it's we are done with chapter 9 and we're going through a vocabulary. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate your continued presence, and I will see you in the next reading vlog. It's not really a reading vlog, is it? It's like a reading, it's like I read aloud and people listen, like my viewers, you guys listen, and it's like, what should I call it? Should I call it? I tried read aloud series for the last video, and kind of made sense to me. So maybe I'll just call it read aloud series chapter 9, read aloud series chapter 10, all of that. So I'll see you next video. Bye bye.